Welcome to In-House Legal Uncovered, a Major Lindsay and Africa podcast exploring what it takes to make it in-house.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of In-House Legal Uncovered in 2024. My name is Michael Sachs, and I'm a partner at Major Lindsay in Africa and our in-house counsel recruiting group. The theme of this podcast continues to be candid and engaging conversations with leading individuals in the legal industry. So far this year, we've spoken to several general counsels with great insights into the legal industry and how they've become successful. This week is no different, but I do think today's guest has a bit of a different background with a lot more government experience than some of the other people we've spoken with. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to our show someone who I've known for a few years now. We'll get to that in a bit. Heath Tarbert, who's the Chief Legal Officer and Head of Corporate Affairs at Circle, a global financial technology firm. Heath, welcome to the In-House Legal Uncovered podcast.
It is great to be here. Thank you so much, Mike. And let me just say, I am particularly honored to be at a podcast by Major Lindsay in Africa. I don't think there's any firm that better has their pulse on the legal industry than you guys. Even in my own career, I remember there have been a number of times that I've reached out to your partners for advice and counsel, including most recently yourself. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Very, very, very flattering, very gracious of you. Heath, we're going to have a great conversation. We're going to get into a few various things, but let me your background is obviously a great background, a tremendous background to go over. So I'm just going to give some of the highlights, if you don't mind, so people know who you are. And I mentioned you are the Chief Legal Officer and Head of Corporate Affairs at Circle, which is a global financial technology firm that enables businesses of all sizes to harness the power of stablecoins and public blockchains for payments and commerce. And prior to joining Circle, Heath was the Chief Legal Officer of Citadel Securities, where he was responsible for the firm's global legal, compliance, surveillance, and regulatory affairs functions. Heath previously served as the 14th chairman and chief executive of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, vice chairman of the International Organization of Securities Commissions, and a voting member of the Financial Stability Oversight Council. And before the CFTC, Heath was the assistant secretary of the Treasury for International Markets and Development, concurrently serving as a G7, G20 deputy finance minister, a member of the Financial Stability Board, and U.S. Executive Director of the World Bank Group. Now, earlier in his career, Heath also served as a U.S. Supreme Court clerk for Justice Clarence Thomas, which I think everybody knows is an incredibly prestigious honor. Also Associate White House Counsel, Special Counsel to the Senate Banking Committee, and a partner at 2 international law firms. Heath is also the recipient, which I did not know this, of several public service awards, including the Alexander Hamilton Award, the Department of the Treasury's highest honor, the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, and the Freedom of the City of London for strengthening financial regulatory relations between the U.S. and the United Kingdom. Quite an impressive background, and I probably left out half of it as well. So you've had quite a career.
I can't hold the job, Mike, but here we are. It's been quite an adventure.
Now, maybe one of your greatest accomplishments also is you're married to Kate Tarbert, 2 kids, and I know this because the reason I really know Heath actually is that we are neighbors. We live probably about a mile from each other. You actually live in the house that my wife's first cousin used to live at. And so I've been in your house several times, while you've lived there. And also our kids are kind of around the same age. And so you and I have been on a couple Cub Scout and most recently Boy Scout campouts together.
Yes, we've slept outside in the rain. And if this all goes well, Mike, you'll even be invited back to the house, even under my ownership. But no, it's really wonderful to see you in this capacity. And you're exactly right. You didn't say this, but the truth, of course, is that the much more distinguished and better lawyer in our house is my wife. But nonetheless, I'm here today, but maybe one day she'll appear as well. But she's also vice president of our school board here in our village.
Right. And of course, you and I could spend a minute. My wife was a member of that school board back in the day, so we have that in common. I should also mention before we get into the questions, also, your wife was also a clerk for another U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Justice Roberts, and Chief Justice Roberts. So it's also quite an accomplishment for the Tarbert family as well, which I'm sure you're both incredibly proud of and should be.
No, it's great to be here, and we've both very much enjoyed our careers to date.
Well, let's start, Heath, just kind kind of a setup question, walking through a bit of your fascinating career. I think each time I talk to you, I learn a little bit more about what you've done. But, in a couple minutes, just how did you get from kind of there to here, so to speak?
Well, it's interesting. I remember Steve Jobs once said in a commencement address, it's hard to connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. And my career actually takes a much more circuitous path, I think, than many other legal careers, which seem to be pretty linear, even though they go up. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, sort of lower middle class family. Was the first in my family to go off to a 4-year college. My father was an accountant by training. And so when I said, Dad, what should I major in? He said, anything, son, but accounting. But yet I saw what accounting did for us, accounting and finance. It really took our family from, a pretty tough blue collar environment and gave us a chance, to provide and to go to attend, local schools and pay for college. And so I actually majored in accounting. And part of it was I thought I wanted to be an FBI agent. And then go on to law school. But from an early age, I had always seen people on television and everything else, and they were lawyers. And so I had it in my head from an early age that, well, one day I want to be a lawyer, at least for some portion of my career. So I majored in accounting and finance, went on to law school, and it was there that I really got a sense of, well, these things could be combined. And so I did a law school project, an article on bank capital rules, which at that point in time in the late 1990s was very arcane.
Mm-hmm.
No one knew about it, but yet, of course, a decade later, everyone was talking about it on the front page of the Times after the financial crisis. Went off to become a corporate lawyer. I wanted to be a corporate lawyer. I also spent a year in England, went off to be a corporate lawyer, and found myself in Washington, D.C. doing corporate work, and realized that at least for the next couple of decades, I really wanted to spend my career in Washington. So that led me to apply for some clerkships, to clerk, as you mentioned, first for the DC Circuit and then for the Supreme Court. I then worked in the White House counsel's office and a variety of government jobs, ultimately culminating in the CFTC chairmanship. But I was also a partner at a couple of law firms as well. So that's sort of the history. And again, it was somewhat circuitous, and we can talk about those various inflection points that I had and how I ended up in various spots.
Yeah, that's great kind of summary of a lot of different, places in your career. You mentioned in passing that you spent that year in England. I mean, that's obviously it is unique. Not many people, once most people get their law degrees, they're kind of in their law firm path. And maybe this is one of those inflection points. But I didn't even know about your time at Oxford until our most recent camp out together, and you mentioned it, and then of course I saw it. But talk about the decision to do that, maybe. What was it like there? That's really interesting.
Yeah, so in college, my parents were kind enough to basically say, son, we didn't get a chance to go off to college. We want you to have a college experience, but here's the deal. We're going to pay for a state school tuition so you can go to state school, or we'll pay that same amount if you go to a private school. So I ended up going to a private school for undergrad. But in order to get myself through college, I earned some scholarships, but also was a resident assistant. Um, and what that meant, however, was that because I was a resident assistant for those years, I never got a chance to study abroad. Then I went right off to law school. But in my mind, I had always said, I would love to have the chance to quote unquote study abroad. But it just wasn't meant to be, at least at that time. When I arrived in law school at Penn in Philadelphia as a 1L, every other 1L had another 1L as their roommate. But I had somebody completely different. It was a guy with a very slick Scottish accent, a very thick Scottish accent, a Glaswegian accent. And I'm not sure I can, well, he sort of sounded a lot like this, And I was like, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Scotland, and he was studying history. The short of it is basically he was there on a fellowship, which was a fellowship that was established more than 60 years ago for Americans to go to Britain and for Britons to go to America and to study at Penn. And so he encouraged me, when you graduate from Penn, you should think about going to the UK. So fast forward a couple of years later, I summered in the London office at a law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. And I said, well, you know what? I have the rest of my life to work. And this is a piece of advice I'd give to any law students that are currently listening. You're going to have the rest of your life to work. I applied for this scholarship on a whim, was able to go to Oxford and ultimately get a degree in comparative law. And it was a fascinating experience. Kid from Baltimore, I'd never been overseas, and that was sort of my experience living abroad. But it also ended up, as I mentioned about the looking backwards, connecting the dots, is that I ended up studying under the Allen and Overy Professor of Corporate Law and learning about British corporate law, which is somewhat different from American corporate law. Well, years later, I ended up becoming a partner at Allen and Overy, and now as a GC, our parent company, at least for the time being, is Irish, and we're actually undergoing a scheme of arrangement, which is a very unique British sort of Anglo-Irish corporate law concept that I learned about in Oxford. So it all comes back in some ways, and so it was a unique experience. And my advice would be for in-house lawyers of the future, as well as law firm lawyers of the future, you're going to be exposed to all different kinds of legal systems. And so I really would encourage you, if you have an opportunity to explore another major legal system, to do it, because you'll find yourself actually ending up making decisions based on foreign law, and to have a little bit of background can be incredibly helpful.
I was going to make a comment that it's like your career is a circle, so to speak, and it all comes back. But I feel like that might be a little bit pun intended there, so to speak. But yes, I can see that. I mean, I can say too, though, like I feel like I've had a rewarding career, but my one big regret of my career is that I never really did spend that international time that somebody like you did out there, because I'm sure you got a lot of it must have even, I mean, you talk about how it's impacting you now with the current, matters you're working on, but it must have obviously impacted you greatly just as you looked at kind of gave you more exposure to like the world. And while you were dealing with some of the crises of the 2000s, you must have had that exposure, which must have helped exponentially in you kind of looking at the situations.
Yeah, I've had the privilege over my career to meet a ton of lawyers from countries around the world, and to sort of get an appreciation for how they're both similar but also unique to us. So at Oxford, I get to meet, fellow lawyers from all over the world. And then as a partner at major international law firms, my last firm at Allen and Overy, now A&O Shearman, I think they had something like over 30 or 40 different offices, over 30 different countries. So it was a rich experience. And as a Treasury Assistant Secretary in the International Division, I made use of that knowledge and also those contacts.
So one thing, obviously, you've had a lot of things when I look at your background, they're incredibly impressive. But one thing that certainly for many people that's going to stand out is that you clerked for a U.S. Supreme Court justice. And I think anybody listening probably knows, but there's a handful of those people across the entire country that get that prestigious accomplishment. I've always kind of wondered, like, what is that? You were very humble when you said, "Oh, I applied for these clerkships and all that." And obviously, again, having a DC clerkship first, then moving on to Justice Thomas. What is that process like at that level, without getting into confidences and what was said here and there? But what is that like, and what's that feeling when you find out that you've been asked to have this clerkship? Just take us behind the curtain for that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Well, in many ways, the best analogy I've heard to getting a Supreme Court clerkship is being struck by lightning. And in my case, that was certainly my experience. I did well in law school, but I certainly wasn't, the Supreme Court oral advocate, editor-in-chief of the Law Review, et cetera, et cetera. I was just very lucky. But ultimately, you have to clerk for a appellate court judge first, a circuit judge, and the quality of the circuit judge often sort of enhances and your chances for clerking for the Supreme Court. So in my case, I was lucky enough to clerk for Douglas Ginsburg, who at the time was chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. A great man. He's a great scholar. Was a professor at Harvard Law School. Was nominated to be on the Supreme Court during the Reagan administration for a short period, and just an incredible, rigorous experience. When you go to the Supreme Court, and so thousands of people apply, 36 are ultimately chosen, and I was lucky enough to again get an interview with Justice Thomas. And my view is, like, just getting an interview with a Supreme Court justice is an incredible honor. I can tell my grandchildren about it. And so I when I sort of what are the interviews like? Well, normally for all of the justices, there's a rigorous sort of substantive interview, and often that's conducted by the clerks rather than the justice himself. So when I walked in there, and I had been a corporate lawyer, I hadn't even started my DC Circuit clerkship yet. So these guys were just incredibly trained. And just to give you a sense of who I ended up interviewing with, one of them, Jeff Wall, went on to become acting Solicitor General of the United States and argue 31 cases before the Supreme Court. Another is a district judge here in Chicago, and the other two were equally amazing. So I walked in there, and boy, the barrage hit me.
Those were his current clerks. Those were his current
clerks at the time. Exactly. Okay. And so they drilled in for 1 to 2 hours on all aspects of constitutional law, case law, recent cases, old cases, the founding fathers. I mean, you name it, they were all over it, and I was doing my best. I cringe when I think about what I was like at the time, but for some reason I managed to get through it. And to some extent, it's one of those, you just have to do better than the other candidates. But I somehow made it through. And then you interview with the justice, and that interview depends on the justice himself or herself. And in my case, I think Justice Thomas had sort of concluded, if you made it to this point, and it's the right, I think, approach, is basically you've got the academic credentials and what you need to actually succeed on the job as a technical matter. And I would say for every person that interviews with a justice, there's at least a dozen people that can do the job as well, and in my case, probably better than me. So the justice really needs to determine, do I want to spend hundreds of hours with this person over a period of time under considerable stress? So it's sort of like, do you gel with this person? And with me, his question was, look, unlike the other people that are right out of law school, you actually worked for a few years, you were a corporate lawyer, you were making money. Like, are you serious about this? And so I basically said, I was like my one shot. I was like, I am very serious about this. And in fact, I would do the job for free if offered. And then he was like, oh, you're serious. Now, today he tells the story that apparently I said I would pay him to do the job, but it was something like that, where I had to stress to him how critical and important I thought the job was to me as a young American and how I wanted to do it. And so then the interview ended. I went off, and then over the next 3 months, I heard about all the other people that Justice Thomas had hired through.
I was going to ask how long it was. It's exactly. Not the next day. They don't call you the next day.
No, well, they didn't call me the next day. So I think again, I managed to slip through, and so he ended up now. And again, this is the struck by lightning and the irony. He ended up hiring 6 or 7 people that summer. Huh. So I clearly wasn't the first pick. I wasn't the second pick. I wasn't the third pick. And I heard they didn't tell me I didn't get it, but I never heard anything. But I just heard about all these other people being announced. They're clerking for Justice Thomas. So I was like, well, I guess I blew it. But nonetheless, it was a tremendous meeting. Justice Thomas was wonderful, and I can tell my grandkids about it. And then 3 or 4 months later, I get a call out of the blue from someone who says, we're calling from Justice Thomas's chambers. And I called them back immediately, and they said, well, I think we have some good news for you, but there's a bit of a wrinkle. The justice would like you to clerk for him, but he would like to clerk 2 years out from now. And I basically almost dropped the phone, but was able to answer, if he wants me to clerk 20 years from now, I will. I will be there. I'll mark the calendar.
You didn't say let me think about it and get back to you.
I did not say let me think about it. So there it was, and again, it struck me from out of the blue, a tremendous honor. And like I said, all these other people had gotten it, but somehow, for some reason, there was an offer for me, and I embarked on that wonderful clerkship that I'll never forget.
A quick aside on that, it's a great way to tell the story, obviously. Quick aside, do other people actually who do turn it down? Like when he said, are you serious about this? Is there anybody who actually turns down a Supreme Court clerkship?
I have never heard such a story, But what I would say is that if there's anyone out there that isn't sure they want to do one or not, do not interview with a Supreme Court justice and turn it down. So if you're not sure you want to do it, then don't interview to begin with, because I don't think you can turn a Supreme Court justice down.
I was going to say, I don't even think, I mean, I applied for a couple of federal clerkships, and I think I was told basically if you interview for this, and that was a federal district judge, and that was 25 years ago. So, at the risk of asking you to summarize an entire year experience in this amazing role in just a minute or two, like what is there? People don't really know. What is the day to day? I mean, I think we can guess a little bit of what it is, but just what do you, when you wake up and you go, like, what's your Wednesday like in February? Give us a sense of that.
Yeah. So first of all, I think a lot of people have overblown. It's a tremendous honor, and obviously it's a great job. But I think people have overblown the influence that clerks actually have. You have to remember that you're coming into this clerkship. Most people are in their late 20s. I was in my early 30s because, again, I had taken a more circuitous route. But you're sitting there with a Supreme Court justice. He or she is probably much smarter than you anyway, and they've got 10 to 20, 30 years experience being a judge. So the idea that you're somehow going to sway them, I think, is completely hubris at best. And so how do you actually help the justices? Well, really, when I think about Supreme Court clerks and what's the value add that they provide, it's really twofold. The first is the fact that the Supreme Court is unique out of most courts around the world in that it actually gets to choose the vast majority, if not all, effectively, of the cases it hears each year. So that means that every year they get 7,000 to 8,000 cert petitions, something in that range. The justices are not sitting and reading all those petitions. That's where the clerks come in. So the clerks sit and they sift through those thousands upon thousands, and they write a memo for each to the rest of the justices. So it's something called a cert pool, where basically the cases come in, we divide them up among the clerks, and then we send memos to all of the justices, basically recommending, should the court hear the case, yes or no. 99.9% of the things are a no, some 99 point something, but there are some where we basically say, yes, this is an important case. The Supreme Court should hear this case, and there's a variety of reasons why the court should hear it. The most common is that you have two courts of appeals, two circuits that are split. It's called a circuit split. And so therefore, that having a national law depends upon that being resolved. Otherwise, we have the same law applied in two different ways, contradictory, in two different parts of the country. And then there are other cases that, because of their magnitude, it's a critical, important question that the American people believe, rightly so, that only the Supreme Court should hear and decide. So sifting through all of that, I'd say, is the main job of the clerks. And then in addition to that, the clerks help with research, with the drafting of opinions. And you got to remember, this is the big league. So the footnote has to be correct. The citation has to be correct. This is for time immemorial. This is the United States, the position of the United States Supreme Court. So you've got to get it right. So proofing, all of that kind of stuff. So the job itself is a 15-hour-a-day job, 6 days a week. It's pretty grueling. And I would say that everybody I know that has clerked for the Supreme Court is incredibly proud of the experience. I don't know many people who would wish to repeat it.
Yeah, it's all 1 year, right? Everybody's 1 year. These are
all
1 year clerkships from everybody. Yeah, and so you need almost like a little bit of like a break after you're done with it. I mean, it's pretty intense for 365 days a year.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is indeed.
And so you probably must have read my next question, but so you have these 36 people a year, X number of people. Do you feel like I'm sure you made friends? I should ask, I mean, was your wife Supreme Court the same year, or was she the year before you then?
She was a couple of years after me, but we worked together on the DC circuit.
Right, for Douglas Ginsburg, exactly. Which I did not know. Again, I learn new facts about you every time. But so these do you? I mean, I'm sure you make friends, but is there a bond in general? with clerks who served even 5 or 10 years before you or after you? Does it matter if they were a clerk for a justice on the same political side? I know we're in times of political strife and things like that. But how do you, if you met somebody in the street who had been a clerk for a justice, 10 years before you in a different political stripe, what would that be like? What kind of bond exists?
There's always a common bond because it's a shared experience, and it's generally a very similar experience. And I don't know what it's like today and what it was like 20 years before I clerked. But what I will tell you is when I clerked, everyone was extremely collegial, and the justices were collegial. At the time, it didn't matter whether you were appointed by Nixon or Reagan or Clinton or Carter. Well, there was no Carter appointee, so it'd be Clinton. And it didn't matter because they all were adults in the room. So when you think about some of the worst aspects of Washington today, the Supreme Court really were men and women of integrity. They really cared about their job, and they worked awfully hard. The justices were working 70, 80-hour weeks to get done what they needed to get done. And the clerks, the collegiality that the justices sort of fomented went down to the clerks as well. So even if we disagreed and we knew that our eventual justice would side in a different way, there was no animosity. It was all about, let's make sure the court works on behalf of the American people and everyone is professional. And so I still keep in touch with many of the law clerks during my term. There was an individual who was a fabulous gentleman who was recently nominated by President Biden for a district court seat in Hawaii, and myself, along with a number of other co-clerks or clerks that year, signed a letter to his character supporting the nomination. And so, it's terrific. The people I clerked with, all clerks for Justice Thomas, we also share a bond. We try to get to know one another, to see the justice, and other justices have reunions as well. And then people who either clerked with me or didn't clerk for Justice Thomas, there's still a bond there because we have that shared experience. And when I'm looking out to hire to hire external law firms, I'll often hire former Supreme Court clerks because I know what they've been put through, and I know that they'll get the job done on time with the degree of precision and accuracy that one would expect.
Yeah, that's great. Well, look, I could easily spend hours talking with you about just this experience, but your career has obviously been so many other things that you've done. So you're one of those unique lawyers who's had a combination of law firm experience, in-house experience, government practice. You kind of address this a little bit in your very first answer, but as you've had these various roles, has there been kind of like a North Star that you've been following? You mentioned circuitous a couple of times, or were the different agendas you had in mind when you accepted, different positions? How have you kind of made these choices over your career to kind of go then and there and various different roles that you've had? I'm sure it's about a lot more than being able to keep a job.
No, in some ways it's funny because you think you have choices, but then life turns out, and in some ways, there's a big question: do I choose circumstances, or do circumstances choose me? My first in-house foray was actually right after the Supreme Court clerkship. So everyone else, as you said, after working 15-hour days, we were exhausted. And so many people took time off. There was a nice clerkship bonus. They were about ready to start their legal careers. They went backpacking in Europe. They sipped wine. They did whatever. They read the novel that they
That's not what you did. That's not what you did, Heath.
No. So that is not what I did, which probably some regret now. I did the opposite. I was going to take some time off, and I got a call from friends of mine who were in the White House counsel's office under George W. Bush. It was the last 6 to 8 months of his term as president, and they basically said, Heath, we need some people in here. We've got some open spots. And I had a background in executive privilege. I had worked at OLC in between my two clerkships. So they said, we'd love you to come to the White House counsel's office to serve the president, to think about the law of executive privilege. And you're just coming off your Supreme Court clerkship. Why don't you come in here and do this to the end of the Bush administration, his second term? So I went ahead and basically jumped from the frying pan to the proverbial fire or whatever, and went into the White House at the very end. But here's the irony and the twist, Mike. You talked about circuitous and these things. I go into the White House thinking I'm going to be sort of, here I am, the Supreme Court clerk, doing constitutional law and advising the president on Article 2. And they look at me and they say, well, you've got this financial background. You were at Sullivan and Cromwell. You're a CPA, all of this sort of stuff.
I can see where this might be going.
See, this is where it's going. And so they said, we're going to give you the financial markets portfolio. It's at the end of the administration, so don't worry. There's probably not going to be a lot of activity.
Don't worry.
2 weeks later, Fannie and Freddie are collapsed. Lehman Brothers goes into receivership. So the short of it is, what happens is I become the White House associate counsel full-time on the global financial crisis. And it was sort of that pivot that at that point I said to myself, all right, well, look, you do have this sort of interesting background where you've got a financial background. You've also got sort of the DC law experience. Perhaps you should put them together and focus on financial regulation. And so because of that experience, again, not something I had intended. It was circumstances, not necessarily intention. I've spent the last 20 years or so, or the last 15 years, on that path to financial regulation. So that was sort of a key turning point and my first in-house job.
So it's a little bit of the Abraham Lincoln answer, right? Is it that events have shaped you rather than maybe you shaped events, so to speak?
That's definitely the case. I certainly can't say I've shaped events, but no, and you just have to learn. Life. It's sort of don't expect from life. Life expects from you, and so it's incredible. And then you asked about well, how are these jobs different, and how do you think about choosing these jobs? The best piece of advice I've heard on sort of career changes, next chapters, etc., is you shouldn't take a job for what you're going to get out of it, monetarily or otherwise. You should take a job for what it will make you. What are you going to become as a result of this position? In each of those roles, I sort of became something different. So as a law firm partner, as a law firm lawyer, and ultimately as a law firm partner, I learned how to master a field of law. I learned how to be an expert in the craft. And that was incredibly helpful. As an in-house lawyer, I came to understand how important it is to be part of the business. And so as an in-house lawyer, when I look and think about some of the memos I wrote as a law firm partner that were esoteric and weren't very practical, I look at myself and say, wow. So learning about business how to be commercial, and then government, I would say, really, you have a tremendous opportunity to develop leadership there. Because in government, you get a ton of responsibility. And it's and in some cases of matters of national importance. And so the ability to work in places like the White House or to chair a federal agency, when I think about sort of the most hectic days that I have in the private sector, they're nothing compared to the White House.
I'll put a plug in too. I mean, a lot of people ask, they call up and they want to know what are the skills they need to be a general counsel. And there's obviously very many things. It depends on industry. But one of the things that's consistent throughout almost any client is management experience, being able to manage a team. And at an early part in someone's career, there's no better place to get that experience probably for most people than a government role, just because of the sheer size of it and the numbers of people and the opportunities available. So there's all sorts of other things somebody needs to be a GC, but that's one very, very, very crystal clear thing. And you can get that from government experience more than almost anywhere else early on.
That's exactly right.
So, I was looking at your background and sizing up the dates, and you had the CFTC role under a very interesting time. You were there. I looked at the dates, 2019 to 2021. So I did my math. I looked at my history books, and I saw that was the COVID era and the end of the Trump presidency, and you were there. So again, trying to ask you to synthesize, 15 incredibly stressful months or whatever it was, 18 months into a minute or two. But what must have that have been like? That was right before you came to Illinois to join us in our neighborhood.
Yes, and so that's a great example where sort of, as I think Eisenhower said, plans are useless, but planning is invaluable. Or I think it was Clausewitz or somebody, some great, maybe it was General Mokhtar, or somebody from the German High Command in Prussia, that basically said no plan survives, its interaction with the enemy.
By the way, you
And
are the second person to quote General Eisenhower to me today. This is the second time this has happened today. So
well, a great man, an American
somebody
hero.
said it. What was the other quote? Was that leadership is not bopping people on the head. It's actually, or something like that. It's not leadership is not bopping people on the head. And they talked about that. I think it was a podcast interview with Leon Panetta. So yeah, just
Ah,
this morning that I was listening to. So yeah.
fantastic. Yeah, so that was a situation where I came into the agency. It was a tremendous opportunity. I've often said that the CFTC is the most important financial regulator most Americans have never heard of. It actually regulates the world's largest markets that underpin virtually everything we do. The gasoline we put in our gas tanks, even if you have an electric car, the electricity that you put it that powers your electric car, the milk that you buy on the shelf, the bread that you eat, as well as things like crypto, like Bitcoin, for example, now. And so the derivatives markets that underlie our larger commodities markets are essentially critical to the functioning of America. So I came in and we had a grand plan. We ended up rewriting the mission statement of the agency that everyone bought into, vision, values, and a very ambitious rulemaking plan. And then COVID hits.
Mm.
So then the question is, well, what do you do? Well, it was clear we couldn't just move on doing what we were doing, at least for the time being. We had to pivot. And the commodities markets at that point were reacting to the greatest volatility and greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression, not just the financial crisis, but literally the real economy started to slow down or had a chance of slowing down. I was told when I took the helm at the CFTC, you need to be really careful, son, because if oil gets to $150 a barrel, people are going to want your head. Well, oil went negative. No one had ever expected that oil, not that it would go high, but rather it would go below zero. And so really it was an opportunity for the men and women of the CFTC, and my job as the chair of the agency, to really get them to make sure we were on top of everything and that the markets functioned well. And they did, because people rely on the derivatives markets to hedge risk, and the markets functioned extremely well under dire stress. So it was really focusing on the markets first and foremost, and then on the families, obviously, of the people at the agency. And we needed to make sure they were taken care of, they were safe. But at the same time, people were getting laid off. And as a government, as a government employee just like them, I said, guys, we need to work hard, and here's why. We'll be flexible, and I realize people have kids at home, and we're all going through the same stuff, but there are people that are out of work, and we've got solid government jobs. We need to show that we're working hard, particularly given this market stress. So we did. And then I'd say after the first couple of months of COVID, once the market shock had stabilized a bit, then we were able to turn back to that rulemaking agenda, and we got more done than we'd ever
Mm.
could hope to get done. We ended up with like something like 43 final rules that we made done. And we got, in the 18 months that I was chair, we had more open meetings, not than just the year before, but we had more open meetings than the prior 7 years combined, because people weren't talking around the water cooler. We weren't going on fancy trips. We just were working hard. So we were able to turn that experience of COVID into something that was incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Well, look, we're going through your career a little bit chronologically in some ways. I can't hit every position, but let's talk about where you're at now. So you're at Circle. So give a plug. What does your company do? You're the chief legal officer. So what's the role? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Circle is really building the next generation of the financial system, which is going to be on the internet. So in summary, I would say, really, by building the largest and most widely used stablecoin network in the world, Circle is going to be part of the financial system of the future, and a main part of its infrastructure as a platform company. So people are like, well, all right, well, that sounds really cool, but what does that actually mean? And what I would say it means, just for everyone listening, is right now the money doesn't is still in the 1970s and 1980s. We still use credit cards, and we have exchange transfer fees, and we still use these old proprietary systems that are closed loop systems. But if you think about what we're doing now, we're talking over the internet. Major other industries have moved onto the internet. And only with the advent of blockchain technology have we been able to actually transfer value over the internet, because otherwise you can't really do it. So if you can send a dollar as easily as you can send an email, safely, securely, and instantly, without any middleman, without paying the fees, that is the future. And that's what Circle is all about.
And you and your team, I mean, how many lawyers do you have there on your team?
We've got about 25 people. We've got folks in Singapore, in France, and then throughout the United States. We've got experts in commercial contracts, obviously litigation, regulatory, and IP. And the great thing about this job, and why I was so interested in doing it, is because here we're not just sort of considering the law and applying it. We're actually helping to define what the law will be. The technology is 5 years or 10 years even ahead of the law. And so we're working with regulators and legislators and others to figure out, well, how should this new internet financial system be regulated properly? So I'm sort of using everything that I've hopefully gathered throughout my career in law, in administrative agencies, in finance, and thinking about what's the paradigm government regulation wise for the next 20 years.
There's a big policy aspect of the job at the end of the day.
Huge policy aspect of the job. And I'm also the head of corporate affairs, which sort of plays into that.
So this is a podcast about sort of in-house legal, and so obviously I ask you about all these other positions because I personally find them so fascinating and interesting. But let's think about those in-house jobs for a second. So most people will take a role because they feel fondly about the CEO that they're going to be working for or working with. What do you kind of look for in your various roles that you've had over the tenure? What are the skills you like to see in the person? What are, for people who are looking for these kind of roles, what they should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so these are individuals who want in-house jobs.
Yeah, people who want in-house jobs, and they're either going to be reporting to a CEO or maybe even it's a lower level position. They're reporting to a GC. What should they be on the lookout for? What do you look for?
So I think you want to look at, do you buy into the leader and do you buy into the company when you're joining an in-house role? Because remember, you're only going to have one client, which is the company. And so if you're not passionate about the company and what it does, or at least you're not very interested in it, it's not going to be as fun of a role. When I think about, if you're an aspiring GC and you're looking at a CEO or a chairman that you're going to report to, I think it ultimately comes down to trust. Do you trust this person? And then the question becomes, okay, what does it mean to trust? And the best definition of trust that I've seen is it's the combination of competence and character. So let's take competence first. John Maxwell has written a number of books on leadership, and one of his leadership laws is basically leaders will only work for better leaders than themselves, all things being equal. So you want to find a CEO who's a better leader than you, who you can learn from, you can learn from and you can grow from. Just like I said before about what's the job going to make you. And then the person also needs to understand the industry, and really be a great strategist so the business can move forward. So that's competence. And then is character. That's the second component. In some ways, that's the far more important. Does this person have integrity? Can you trust them, particularly as a GC? And we've seen, particularly in the blockchain digital asset space, but quite frankly, in every industry, we've seen what happens when CEOs and other business leaders don't have integrity. So in my situation, our leader, Jeremy Allaire, is just a tremendous visionary, technical expert, technologist, and leader who wants to do the right things the right way. And that's often incredibly hard to find. So I was attracted to him personally, and I was attracted to his vision for what Circle can do for the millions and tens of billions of people out there that don't have access to money, that don't access to bank accounts, that want to be able to send money back and forth without paying hefty fees, right? And I would say he's also, compared to some of the other folks, he's in his early 50s. He's still incredibly energetic, but he's not like a quote unquote kid with a t-shirt, right? And you see some of that in Silicon Valley, and many of them are very brilliant. But the Steve Jobs in the 1970s was a very different leader to the Steve Jobs that we saw in the 90s and the 2000s, who made Apple, ultimately the most valuable company in the world. So finding someone that's both competent and that has character and that's seasoned is something that I personally look for.
And then one of the things in my business we hear about a lot is people talk about hiring a GC who's going to fit in well with an executive team, and that's why we hired them. So, you hear that a lot. You kind of wonder, what does that mean, fit in? What is that like? You've had a number of general counsel roles. Like, what is that? What's important when, maybe you're interviewing another member of the executive team, the new,
Right.
What do you look for in that kind of regard?
Well, an executive team is probably similar to a sports team. If you're going to build a championship team, you need all of the right players in the right positions to have the skill set, right? So the quarterback's going to be built very differently than the tackle, right? And the different role, and the wide receiver versus the kicker and everything else. And so when you have a chief technology officer, when you have a chief financial officer, they're going to have very different backgrounds than those of us listening to this podcast that have legal backgrounds. So you got to know, like, these people know their stuff. But at the same time, you've got to have a common vision with them. You've got to be able to communicate with them, and ultimately, you've got to be able to trust them. And so, collegiality is really important, and trying to seek to understand, what they do and why they do it is really important. Because all of them are your client. As the GC, you've got the board, you've got the CEO, and then you've got the rest of the members of the executive team, and all the lawyers that report to me. Those are our clients. And so really getting a respect for what they do and their perspective and how they use legal services is absolutely critical.
Yeah. So, Heath, we've talked about your career and all the various, things you've done, and you almost feel like you're like a recent Forrest Gump in terms of being in all these amazing, situations and all that. And hopefully you take that as a compliment, because that's the way it was intended. But what are you most proud of? From your career? What are the things you look back on that you've accomplished in your career? What do you look back on?
The thing I'm most proud of probably has nothing to do with law, but really it has to do with leadership. And I would say that good leaders are individuals who are able to sort of set a direction for a company and move people in that direction. And I'm still learning. I'm still on a path. There's no question about it. So I've tried to do that. But I'd also say that great leaders are people that make other leaders, that create other leaders. And so when you ask, what am I most proud of? I'm most proud of when my team members go on and they take up the helm. So for example, at the Treasury Department, I had 4 political direct reports. I had 2 career direct reports, and they went on to do very well. But of the 4 deputy assistant secretaries, 3 of them were nominated and confirmed by the president to become assistant secretaries. One of them became a special assistant to the president at the White House. At the CFTC, my executive team members there went on to do great things, including the newest general counsel for the New York Stock Exchange. She was my chief operating officer. So developing these leaders, and she hadn't had a real leadership position before that, but I saw in her the potential for greatness, and now she is a leader in the private sector. And here in my in-house roles, my goal is to make whatever company I'm at the destination for the industry for future GCs, future deputy GCs, future chief compliance officers, etc. So that really is what I'm most proud of. I'm most proud of when my team members go on and they step up and they become leaders.
Well, you've been kind enough to have a couple people speak to me that have worked for you, and they've always said incredibly gracious and kind things about having worked with you and about what a positive, incredible experience that was. So I'm sure that it does not surprise me that would be something you would focus on for sure. One thing you and I have gotten to know, obviously, is that we are on Cub Scouts and then Boy Scouts. And one of the very first conversations I think I had with you, maybe not the first one, but you mentioned how becoming an Eagle Scout when you were younger was, I don't remember how you phrased it, but you said it's something that you're that you're, I don't remember how you phrased it, but I could sense that you were incredibly proud of having achieved that. And I know you're not the first person who I've heard that from. I think Rex Tillerson might have said something similar back when he was in the news a lot. So I think I asked you at the time, and I am curious, like, why you feel that way, what that experience was like. And you can tell from our campouts, Heath, I'm not a Boy Scout person. I'm learning and things like that. So I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about that.
Well,
and I heard you gave, by the way, I heard you gave a great speech at the Boy Scout on Sunday. Unfortunately, I missed it, and I heard you transformed into a suit for the event, which was very impressive.
Well, so it's been a pleasure to come back into Scouts as an adult leader, and to sleep on the ground in the middle of Illinois again in a rainstorm with you a couple of weeks ago. So that definitely has hardened me. Maybe I've become a little soft in these roles as a GC and chief legal officer, but Boy Scouts definitely put you down to size when we're eating half-cooked brats and sleeping in the rain. But yes, interestingly enough, I will say that being an Eagle Scout is the professional achievement I'm most proud of, because in many ways it was the first, but it also shaped me. And I'm a big believer in Scouts. I really think that at a young age, Scouts is a tremendous program. And again, this was one where I was, I didn't pick Scouts. Scouts picked me. I was terrible at every single sport I ever tried. I have virtually zero athletic bone in my body. I was a pudgy kid. I needed to find something that got me off the couch and into a physical environment with team, and that was Scouts. And so through Scouts, I mean, the motto of Scouts is be prepared, right? And quite frankly, that should be a motto for everybody listening who is a lawyer, an in-house lawyer, a general counsel, a chief legal officer, or a chief executive, right? Be prepared. And you learn that at a young age. You go on camping trips, it rains, you complain, but then you toughen up. You learn how to get your tent up quickly, your dining fly, you learn how to pack the right clothes and plenty of them. Boy Scouts teaches you that, there are storms in life and you've got to prepare for them. And then things like the Scout Law, I can still recite it after all these years. Trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. And you think to yourself, well, you know what? If everybody in the business world and in Wall Street and in Washington actually had those things, we may not be in the predicament that we're in today. Right? I'm thinking about Eisenhower. Eisenhower did have those. You mentioned him earlier, but you can debate whether or not many of the people today have those attributes. So I really think Scouts teaches you like what matters, what you should aspire to be. And we all fail. Nobody's perfect. But I think at a young age, having that as a North Star is tremendous. And so now the Scouts have both, boys and girls. And I think, it's terrific that girls can now become Eagle Scouts. I think though there's a question what's going to happen to Girl Scouts. But ultimately, instilling all young people with the same values that Boy Scouts have had over the era, I think will continue to make, better leaders for the future.
Well, as a father of somebody who's both a Boy Scout right now and a Girl Scout, they both love the experience, and it's been tremendous for them already. So I'm going through the scouting experience for the first time through my kids, and so everything you're saying registers. And I do think we could do with more Eagle Scouts in our government. And to your point, I think we'd be in a better situation for sure. I know you've been very generous with your time. Just one last question, I guess. I mean, you've done all these things we talked about. Are there any other, career aspirations? It doesn't have to just be practicing law, but anything else you're maybe looking to achieve as you hit this 50-yard line, so to speak, for your career? Anything else you're looking to get to?
Well, I look at myself and I say, look, you're very much still a work in progress. And Benjamin Franklin once said that the doorstep to the temple of wisdom is knowledge of our own ignorance. So there's a ton more I need to learn. I want to continue to develop and be a better leader. And so any opportunities that I have that enable me to do that, I think I would pursue. I'm very passionate about Circle and what it hopes to achieve. So I have no doubt I'll be there for some time. But after that, I think again, I seek out positions that can make me better and where I can develop leaders. So whether that's in government, whether that's in other companies, on boards, as well as in education, I really think that's critically important. Educating the next generation of law students so they can be leaders. So we'll see what happens. But no, it's been truly an honor. And again, I'm grateful for you taking the time because I know how many people you've helped in their careers, and I know that I have always found great guidance when I've come to you. So it's particularly an honor for me to be here with you today.
I appreciate that. Two last things I'll say. We've quoted Dwight Eisenhower, Benjamin Franklin, and Abraham Lincoln in this podcast. So we're hitting almost. I'm trying to think of we need a Teddy Roosevelt quote. Although I think I've used all those since my dog's name is Teddy Roosevelt. And
well,
then second,
in the arena, we can leave with the note that regardless of who you are listening to this podcast, don't be afraid to climb in the arena. At some point, you're going to need to.
You've definitely been in the arena. I think that's a sure thing. And I was going to say, if you're looking for something else, I hear our local school board might have some elections in a couple of years. So if you're interested in running and carry on the Tarbert tradition, I hear there's some elections coming up soon.
I think our wives, your wife and mine, have done a far better job than I would. But law students, fine. Elementary school students, I probably have a lot less to offer.
That's fair enough. Well, Heath, I really appreciate the time today. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, and always great to speak to you.
Really an honor. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for listening.
Well, that will do it for this episode. We would love to get your feedback on these podcasts. Feel free to email me at msachs@mlaglobal.com and tell me what you liked and what you didn't like and any suggestions for future topics of episodes. So long, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to In-House Legal Uncovered. Join us next time as we dig into another topic that will better help you navigate your in-house legal career.